Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning, as always, by my dear teacher and friend, Rabbi Marc Gellman. Marc, good morning. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Ed. It's
a difficult week.
Oh, man.
It's a difficult week for us all, of course, because the news from Texas this week is so dark and so dire. And as is natural with stories like this, each day the newspaper reveals another layer of the darkness of this story. Horrifying murder of so many children and teachers, the twisted mind of the young man who did it, the availability of super powerful weapons to a person like this, and now the failure of the police department, it turns out to
the 1 hour, they waited an hour.
Horrifying stuff. It's just, and it's such a dark moment and a dark representation on who we are as a people, as a country, as a species, as humanity. And then, what makes this worse, I know this is awful to say, but the Torah portion that is assigned to this week in the traditional calendar is at the very end of the book of Leviticus. Now, what happens in the Bible is when you reach the end of major documents, as was the custom in the ancient Near East, they attach to the ancient document a series of blessings and curses as a series of mandates, sanctions for keeping or not keeping the covenant that was just described. So we're reaching the end of what's called the Holiness Code, which is the last half of the book of Leviticus, began with the clarion call Kedoshim Tihiyu, and it ends with a series of blessings and curses. And to attach these blessings and curses to a week like this one is simply unbearable. It's unbearable because it's almost natural for people when they suffer, when we suffer, when something bad happens to us, when the world betrays us or disappoints us or inflicts suffering upon us, it's almost natural for us to turn to heaven and say, why? And the easiest answer, the most simplistic answer, and unfortunately, it is the answer that's given more often, is that this is a punishment, that there is a God, and that God is in charge of managing the world. And God's standard for managing the world is if you are good and loyal, you are rewarded. And if you are evil, you are punished. And to look upon suffering then as a punishment is the most natural thing in the world. And as a rabbi, you'll ask either one of us or any of the rabbis you're close to, they'll tell you that so many times people who suffer want to know, what did I do to deserve this? And why is God punishing me? And
why?
What kind of God, why me? And it's such a painful thing, especially when you know that that's not the way the world works. And it's such a painful, and I understand the question. I understand the question because to imagine that the world is chaotic, to imagine that it is random, that there is no reason or rhyme to why things happen to us, to good and evil, to imagine that rewards and punishments fall upon people randomly and not according to their righteousness, is also a thought that's impossible to accept. Because for so many of us, for so many of us, to live in that random world is worse than to live in a world where God punishes, even if God punishes arbitrarily. So, Marc, let's take up this topic. Do rewards and punishments fall on people according to their deeds?
Well, first of all, this is the engine of the belief system of the Torah. This question, why do bad things happen to good people? The first attempt to deal with this in a world of a good, all-powerful, benevolent God, a benevolent, all-powerful God, the first idea was that there is reward and punishment, and it happens only to the collectivity. That is, only to the people as a whole, and not to individuals. Then the second possibility, beginning with Ezekiel and Jeremiah, ish b'cheto yamut, that each person will now die of his own sins. Where it says, you heard that the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the teeth of the children shall be put on edge, meaning, you react when you eat a sour grape. So the image is, no, your father eats the sour grape, but you squinch up your face, meaning that you could be punished for the sins of your ancestors up to third and fourth generation. But it tries to soften it by saying, but the good goes to the thousandth generation. So that's the second move, is that now good and bad happen to individuals, not just the collectivity, but they happen in this world. As this parsha begins, rain in its season, agricultural abundance, victory in battle, etc. All the rewards are in this world. The third commonwealth, and this question defines the commonwealths of Judaism. The third commonwealth is created by the book of Job, and I think also by Texas, by Uvalde, Texas, in our time, and that is, look, if it's supposed to be that good people are rewarded and bad people are punished, the Bible, the Tanakh, includes a book in which a good man is punished. In fact, as the result of a gambling bet between God and Satan. The whole thing is bizarre. But basically it says, here's a good man and he's suffering, deal with that. And his friends, Eliphaz, the Temanite, and the others who come as comforters, so-called, and of course they aren't comforting him at all. They come and they say, as you just beautifully said, well, you're arrogant, you're suffering because you're arrogant, and your arrogance is that you didn't think you sinned, but you did sin somehow, some way that you overlooked, and you're being punished for your sins. Now, people could not accept that because it isn't true. And it's manifestly not true in Job. The author tells you it's not true. So what happens then? I once helped to edit a radical Jewish journal called Fourth Commonwealth Notes. And that was about the next solution, which turned out, first of all, the third Commonwealth was the rabbinic Commonwealth, where they said, okay, now good and evil, still rewarded, good is rewarded, evil's punished, but it's not collective, it is individual, but it is not this worldly. Their solution, the rabbinic solution, is that the scales of justice are equaled out in the olam haba, in the world to come. I speak about it, forever and always. It's my obsession, the world to come. But it's normally used, people sell the idea by saying, oh, it'll give you hope. It'll give you hope in the face of death. And that's true. But the other advantage of the world to come as a belief, and it is a belief of Judaism, is that it gives justice a chance to work its way out. Providence, which is in Hebrew, it's hashgacha, to good and evil, reward and punishment. It allows that to be worked out in an otherworldly context. So that's the engine of all Jewish thought. First, it's collective, this worldly. Then it's individual, this worldly. Then it's individual, otherworldly. And if you notice, both terms of the original biblical compact have been reversed. It's not collective, it's individual, and it's not this worldly, it's otherworldly. The problem with the rabbinic solution is that you have to believe in the world to come. And if you don't believe in that, then Thomas Hobbes was right when he said, homo hominis lupus, each man is the wolf of his neighbor. That's the way it was, or that's what he thought.
But there's another approach. It's a minority voice within the rabbinic tradition that I think has become a more pronounced voice in modern or postmodern theology. And that's the voice to cease expecting a universe that's so morally ordered, to recognize that you live in a universe that's relatively random, and that the place of God in that universe is really to help us through human responsibility to respond to such a universe and make it at least a modicum more gentle. You have a story in the Talmud Kiddushin. It's a very, very famous and important story. And it's in the context of a conversation about reward and punishment. And the story is that a father tells his son to climb to the top of the barn on a ladder and take the eggs or the fledglings from the nest of a bird that's roosting there. So the kid climbs to the top of the ladder, and before he takes the eggs, he shoos away the mother bird. He shoos away the mother bird.
Which is a biblical commandment.
Well, both of them are. And on the way down, he falls off the ladder and he dies. Now, the problem in this particular case, it's a constructed case, but it's brilliant, is that there are only two commandments in the entirety of the Torah where the reward for the commandment is listed right after the commandment. The first is honor your father and mother, and the second is shooing away the mother bird. And wouldn't you know it, the reward for both of those mitzvot is a long life. So the rabbis ask immediately, wait a minute, the kid was in process of doing both mitzvot. He was obeying his dad, and he shoos away the mother bird, and he falls off the ladder and he dies. How can that be? Now, the very fact that the rabbis have the courage to ask the question, I want to give them credit for that, even if you don't like the answer. The fact that this religious tradition is not a religious tradition which suppresses that kind of question, but actually elevates it into an explicit argument. How can it be? If there's a God and God runs the universe, then how could God had let this happen? How can a God let this happen? So the first thing they do is they try to justify it. Say, well, you know, it's true he was doing these two mitzvot, but he was in the process of doing these two mitzvot, he was an idolater. He was thinking idolatrous thoughts. And the rabbis say, no, it couldn't be, because first of all, he's a kid, and he's not liable to that. And second of all, your thoughts don't count. It's only idolatrous behavior. And then third of all, they say there's a very famous principle, which was that someone who is a shaliach mitzvah, if you're doing a mitzvah on behalf of somebody else, nothing bad can happen to you. That's, by the way, why if someone's going to Israel, you give them a few dollars, they become your shaliach, now nothing bad can happen. Rabbis say, how could it be? How could it be that this happened? Then they say, well, maybe it really didn't happen. They say, no, Rabbi Yaakov was standing there and he watched it happen. And they're panicked. They can't figure out why it happened. And the last line of the sugya, the last line of this section of the Talmud, the rabbis say, so sulam ra'ua. It was a bad ladder. And in places where you should be responsible, you can't expect miracles to take the place of responsibility. Now, the wonderful thing about the sulam ra'ua means there are accidents. Even in God's universe, there are accidents, right? There's brokenness, there's randomness that even God can't heal. And sulam ra'ua means you should have checked the ladder, which means providence, that is divine intervention, is involved in the intelligence to do risk assessment and say, that's dangerous up there. Let's be careful about that. And you can't expect God to come in and rescue you from your own lack of intelligence and lack of responsibility. So you have a new theological approach, which is a fifth one after the ones that you've outlined, which says we live in a random universe. Bad stuff happens all the time, except that it's our job to cure diseases, feed the hungry, care for the homeless, and yes, take guns away from crazy people so they don't hurt our children. And that's what the next layer of answer to the question is, to see divine intervention or divine providence in human responsibility.
That's beautiful. I love that. However,
How it,
Now, the problem with that, and actually the coda to that story, is that one of the great rabbis of the Talmud saw this happen, and the greatest rabbi of the whole Talmud, the most quoted rabbi, Rabbi Meir, was the student of this rabbi. This rabbi saw the kid fall, and then he screamed out, "Late din v'late dayan." There is no justice, and there is no judger. There is no judge.
yeah.
No justice, no judge, meaning there is no God.
Mm-hmm.
And the rabbi who said that was Elisha ben Abuya. And he was, of course, cast out. And in fact, his name in the Talmud was changed to Acher, the other one, because he plucked up the shoots. There's a story about the four who entered the garden, which is relevant, but we don't have time to go into that because Ben Azai was one of them, and Akiba and Elisha ben Abuya.
And Benzoma, yeah.
And Benzoma went mad, and Akiba was the only one who walked out of the garden unhurt. The point is, Elisha ben Abuya said, okay, it wasn't a bad ladder, Eddie. It was not a bad ladder. There was nothing wrong. The kid slipped and fell doing a mitzvah, 2 mitzvot, and honoring his father and the Tsar Ba'alei Chaim, avoiding pain to animals. And he died. And there is no God who could allow that to happen. And my first teacher, Richard Rubinstein, taught me this story, and he said, this is Hitler. This is Hitler. The Holocaust is the same as the tree and the boy. Yeah, it was a bad ladder. Yeah, what? We didn't stop fascism early enough, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I don't care. 1 out of every 3 Jews murdered in 4 years. 1 out of every 3 Jews on earth murdered in 4 years. And God didn't stop this? No. This is not a God I can worship. And it seduced me for a while, and I had to try to get around it and out of it. And it was very tough. But the other side of this issue is the argument that is, I think, even harder than why doesn't God stop this, and why does God punish? Why do bad things happen to good people? Which, by the way, I'm proud to say that I was the reader at Shokin that approved the book for publication. They sent me the manuscript, and they
You did
said,
good.
I said, I think it's good. I think it's good. Give me 10% and I'll tell you how good it is. And so that question, Harold, the question of why do bad things happen to good people is still the engine of disbelief for many people. But the hardest part, I tell you this, and you know it from counseling, the hardest part is when it's right, when Bechukotai is correct. And you know it, I knew it, when I was sitting in the hospital with a dear friend, maybe my dearest friend in the congregation, who was an alcoholic. And he left a golf outing that we were at, and he had too much to drink, and he got into an accident, a fatal car crash, and he died. And I'm visiting him in his last moments. He was unconscious. And talking to the family, who was totally broken. But in the perspective of time, I told him, and his friends told him, you're going to kill yourself. You need to get a grip on your addiction. You need to do this to save your life. And he didn't do it. And you and I have faced children who overdosed in drugs because they didn't do it. When I came out to LA 6-7 years ago and I came to see you, I was depressed and I was not healthy. And part of my time there, aside from being saved by your kindness, part of my time in LA was also my awareness that I was doing this to myself. I was overeating. I was leading an unhealthful life. I wasn't working out. And it was only when I finally owned it, as they like to say, when I owned it, and I owned that I was, as the 12-step programs is, that I was powerless to defeat it without a higher power. And I turned, sounds like a Christian fundamentalist. I turned myself over to God and I said, God, look, I'm trying here. I know that if something bad happens to me, it's on me. It's not on you. And help me to have the courage to turn my health around and my life around and to find hope after Tom Hartman's death. So, and I did it. I did it with God's help. I did it. And I got healthy and I got through the grief work of Tom, and all of it, really almost all of it, was the result of your patient love. And I'm telling you, when I read Bechukotai and people say, well, obviously it's not true that rain isn't held back by God because people sin. Well, not so fast, folks. Not so fast. There is a part to Bechukotai in which we do suffer for our sins. And almost what I learned from my friend who was the alcoholic who died in the car crash, every one of his friends, including myself, said, you know, we didn't do enough. We didn't do enough to try and help him. But he suffered and was killed because of his sins. And I hate to say that because it's so cruel. It sounds cruel. It is cruel to say it. But it has one redeeming factor to it. It was true, Ed. It was true. Now, this doesn't affect our outrage at Texas, where the kids did nothing to merit anything except love and support. But there's plenty to blame down there. It turns out that maybe the police response was delayed, and maybe they didn't follow the police guidelines to go right in and shoot the shooter, which is apparently the new standard for police procedure for active shooters. I don't know, and the facts haven't come out fully yet, so I don't want to make a judgment about that. But what I'm saying is, it's easy to dismiss providence, to dismiss reward and punishment. It's easy to say, as you do, we live in a chaotic world, and what happens to you is completely caprice. It's complete bad luck. It's just bad luck. Well, I'm not, just for the sake of argument here, I'm not buying that. I'm not buying that people who are successful just because they inherit the money. Some of them are geniuses and work very hard, amazingly hard, and their reward is justified. And some people who, and when you ask yourself, and I'm talking now to our listeners, our students who tune in, when you think about the worst people you know, the people who steal, defraud, betray, gossip, the people who do the worst things you know, and I hope it isn't worse than that, which is still bad. Do any of them live really happy lives? How many of them really live happy lives? And you know, I don't know hardly any of them who lived happy lives. They were consumed by their anger and jealousy and their sinfulness, and it destroyed their lives. Now, is that totally true? Of course not. I'm sure there's people who do horrible things, have no guilt, and die, at 105 in their sleep. I'm sure that's true. But in general, the notion that we are punished for our sins is not completely ridiculous.
Well, I'm only going to disagree with you because as you edge up to that belief, you end up hurting people. My friend who has a very serious cancer did not deserve it and did nothing to deserve it. My friend who lost a child did nothing to deserve it. And so that's why I try to stay away from that belief.
Well,
wait. The only caveat, there is one place where I will come close to you, okay? Which is when it happens to me, when I suffer, and then I look back at my own life and I look for the causes of my suffering, or better yet, I learn from my suffering. And I can say to myself, well, I didn't deserve this, but I'm gaining something from it. I can do that for myself. And if I do it for myself, I can say, out of this suffering came something good. Out of this suffering came a new sensitivity, a new depth, a new wisdom, a better way to live. That I can do for myself. And if I do it for myself, then the suffering was not deserved, but it certainly led to something fortuitous. It's led to something good, beneficent. I will never do that for somebody else. I'm not going to say, it's a damn good thing you had that cancer, or it's a lucky thing you did, because that's a horrifying, that's what the friends of Job say to Job. Yeah. And even in the book of Job, like friends like these, you don't need, these aren't friends. Even God castigates them in the end, because you don't go to somebody and say, gee, it's a good thing that this happened to you, or you deserve this, or you brought this on yourself, or what. But if a person does it, I think that there's a moral reckoning which can be and a personal reckoning which can be fruitful, which can be positive. I'm just really afraid of the other side. I'm really afraid of people who point fingers and say, you should, you should have, you could have, you would have, you might have.
Okay.
Standing from the outside, the guilt of that, the shame of that, the darkness of that relation, that's something I'm very worried about.
Well, of course, and you should be. And let me help you at least explain to you how I handled that issue. May be, I think, exactly how you did, which is you kind of bifurcate your mind. When you're counseling somebody, and when I was counseling people, the last thing in the world I would do is judge them or accuse them, or obviously. But there's two parts of my brain here. I'm not sitting in front of a grieving person right now. I am teaching now the Torah. I'm a philosopher. And one of the reasons I took a doctorate in philosophy may surprise you. I was impressed by the courage of philosophers. To say it, to tell the truth, Ed, to tell the truth. You know how much courage it takes to tell the truth?
Right.
So let's separate what we do for grieving people to make them somehow get through that day, and never to accuse them and never to blame them. But there is an entire world out there, Ed, of suffering people who need help from friends.
Yeah.
And part of that help, you've heard of tough love, you've heard of interventions, you've heard of people whose lives have been saved because their friends said, we're not judging you, we're not angry with you. Well, we are angry with you, but we love you and we want you to live. And in order for you to live, you're going to have to hear the truth.
You're killing yourself. And you have to change.
And people said that to me.
Yeah.
They said, Marc, you're killing yourself. And what? Is it better if there's 2 members of the God Squad who die? Is that better? If Tommy dies and you follow him right away? And I, of course, knew that wasn't true. But the point is, when you're talking about the greatest mystery of the world, is goodness rewarded, is evil punished? Is there and essentially the bigger mystery, which is, are we alone out here? Is it all, is the cosmos just a cold, dark, bleak nothingness, which is what Richard Rubinstein believed and tried to get me to believe, which is true. I mean, when you're talking about the mystery of the universe, a little humility is the most important virtue to approach this topic. What? Who are we? We're going to figure this out in our Torah class? Are we going to figure this out today, a week, in our life, in a million lifetimes? No. Gabriel Marcel made a distinction which is powerful. He, in his French existentialist philosopher, and in his book, The Mystery of Being, he said there's a difference between problems and mysteries. Problems can be solved because they aren't really about you. They're about something external to you. Even cancer, aside from you having cancer, but it's outside you, or what, how do you build a better computer chip or whatever? Those are problems. Those are problems. And once you solve them, they go away. People thought phlogiston caused combustion until the French chemist Lavoisier came along and proved oxygen causes combustion. Goodbye. No one ever asked again. It was gone as a problem. However, in addition to problems, there are mysteries. And mysteries, as opposed, Marcel says, a problem is something we constitute. A mystery is something within which we ourselves are constituted. So that means, is goodness rewarded? Well, if you have a joyous view of life, then you must believe that goodness is rewarded somehow, some way, in this world, next world, whatever. The point is, you believe goodness is rewarded. And even just doing the good deed is enough of a reward. If we follow Ben Azai, and I do try to follow it, that the reward of a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. And that living in a world in which, we're doing good things, so God will pay us off. That's a strategic move. That's not a spiritual move. That's not a moral move. That's bribery. It's spiritual bribery. And we need to grow beyond that, to say, look, I do good because I love you and I love doing good and I love what happens to you when I do good for you. And that's enough for me. That's much more than of a reward than I need. I don't need anything else from that. And being happy with just doing good for its own sake evaporates the mystery of providence. And the answer that solves it for me is, I just don't think about that much anymore. I just think about, did I do something good today? That's all I'm thinking about, Eddie. Mm-hmm. And that's how I solve this problem.
So we have to end today, as does the Parsha, with a little bit of hope. And it's a difficult week to find hope. It's a painful week to find hope. But I think we owe each other a little bit of Shabbos hope to go into Shabbat. So Marc, give me a word of hope before we finish, huh?
It's Isaiah, in sitting still, in stillness you shall be saved. The best response to these times is quietness and presence, to just be with people who suffer and not to come to them. This is particularly a rabbinic sin, to explain things, to say, okay, I'm here, 19 kids just got murdered, I'm here to tell you how this all fits. No. Stillness, quiet, and presence. That's the hope that brings healing to the broken.
I appreciate that. And I'm going to offer exactly the opposite truth, which is that the scream of outrage that we hear across the country is an evidence that we haven't given up on our humanity yet. And I pray that it goes somewhere, maybe into legislation, maybe into education, maybe into a new sensibility, although I'm certainly cynical enough to know that it probably won't. But at least the scream teaches me that we haven't let go of conscience altogether. We haven't let go altogether of who we want to be and what kind of world we want to leave for our children. And I appreciate that scream now more than ever. So for the prophets who screamed even though they knew that destruction was coming, for the rabbis who asked such powerful questions even though they knew they couldn't change heaven's decisions, and for all of us who say, I still want something better and I'll find a way, I don't know when and how. I still appreciate that scream. So let me thank everyone for joining us this morning. If you'll stay on, we'll continue this morning. We have a Sabbath worship from Valley Beth Shalom this evening, and of course at 6 o'clock and all week, daily minyan, morning and night. This is the week when we conclude all of our schools. So we want to wish all of our graduates mazel tov, many, many blessings as they go off into the world, difficult world that it might be. Go off into the world with your voices and your talents and your moral visions to make things a little bit better for us all. Marc, thank you for this morning. Have a very good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, my friend.